The Arizona sun, a merciless eye in an endless turquoise sky, beat down on the freshly turned earth of John's grave. Sarah Thompson stood motionless, the dry, oven-like wind whipping strands of hair across her face, stinging her eyes with dust. It had been 3 days since she'd smoothed the parched soil over him. 3 days since the silence of the small cabin had become a suffocating presence. John's voice, rough and weak in his final hours, echoed in her mind's hollow spaces. Hold on to the land, Sarah. Our dream. Don't let it go. Each word was a brand on her heart. Their dream, a small homestead carved from the unforgiving territory, now felt like a crumbling monument to his lost life and her uncertain future. The drought, already a cruel master for 6 long months, had tightened its desiccated grip. What should have been rows of thriving corn, beans, and squash were now brittle, brown skeletons rattling in the wind, a macabre chorus to her grief. The air itself was an enemy, thick with swirling grit that coated everything, finding its way into her mouth, her eyes, the very folds of her worn calico dress. Even the distant, mournful howl of a coyote seemed to underscore her profound isolation. Their lifeline, the hand-dug well near the cottonwood that was itself shedding dry leaves, now yielded only a protesting groan of the pump handle and a slurry of mud with each desperate pull. The silence John had left was a physical weight, pressing in on her, broken only by the ceaseless, sighing whisper of the desert wind through the skeletal remains of their crops. She felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole, yet beneath it, a tiny, stubborn ember of defiance began to glow. This land had taken John. It would not take her spirit, too. Returning to the small, stifling cabin, the heat radiating from its clapboard walls was almost unbearable. The single room, once filled with John's quiet presence and the scent of his pipe tobacco, now felt vast and empty. Sarah moved with an automaton's precision, the familiar chores of fragile dam against the flood of her sorrow. She began the grim task of inventorying their dwindling provisions. The flour sack was alarmingly light, the pinto beans scarce, the strips of jerky John had painstakingly smoked last fall were few. Every scoop of flour, every handful of beans was measured with a miser's exactitude, a defense against a future that seemed to shrink with each passing, sun-drenched day. The water in the single rain barrel by the kitchen door, their last potable reserve beyond the failing well, was perilously low, its surface reflecting the harsh, indifferent sky. A thin film of dust already coated it. Thirst was becoming a constant, unwelcome companion. She spent the long, sweltering afternoon attempting to reinforce the cabin's defenses against the elements. The mud chinking between the rough-hewn logs had cracked and crumbled in the relentless heat, allowing dust and unwelcome critters entry. With a bucket and spade, she mixed fresh mud, a difficult task with so little water to spare, and began the laborious process of patching the gaps. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, grew raw and sore. The repetitive motion was a strange comfort, a physical ache to distract from the deeper ache within. The sun climbed higher, a malevolent presence, baking the will to survive out of the very air she breathed. She worked until sweat stung her eyes and her back screamed in protest, the phantom rhythm of John's hammer blows accompanying her own labored efforts, a memory both bitter and sweet. She had to survive. She had to find a way. A few days later, a hulking shadow darkened the cabin's open doorway. Silas Blackwood, their nearest neighbor, though neighbor implied a warmth entirely absent in the man, stood framed against the blinding sunlight. His own ranch, a vast empire of cattle and dust, sprawled across thousands of acres, many of which, rumor had it, were acquired through means less than honorable. His eyes, the color of a winter sky and just as cold, swept disdainfully over Sarah's small, struggling homestead, lingering on the withered garden and the dilapidated fence. He removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing a pate, sweating in the heat, though his demeanor remained coolly composed. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with false sympathy. "My deepest condolences on your loss. John was a determined man." The pause before determined was laden with unspoken judgment of John's lack of success. "A woman alone now," he continued, his gaze flicking towards the parched fields, then back to her, sharp and assessing. This land's a harsh mistress, especially now. My offer to purchase your section still stands. Generous, I'd say, considering the blight and your current circumstances. His offer, made even before John's passing, had been an insult then. Now it felt like a violation. Best you take it before there's nothing left worth selling, before you're starved out. Sarah's spine stiffened. Grief had hollowed her, but it had also forged a core of iron. "This is my home, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "My husband worked this land, bled for it. I'm not selling." A flicker of something annoyance crossed Blackwood's face before his customary impassivity returned. He gave a slight condescending smile. "Sentiment is a poor crop in a drought, madam. This drought has a way of changing even the most determined minds. You'll see. You'll all see." He replaced his hat, gave a curt nod, and departed, his broad back a receding wall of intimidation. His unspoken message lingered. He would be back. He expected her to fail. The days that followed were a blur of heat, dust, and dwindling hope. From the sagging porch of her cabin, during moments stolen for a sip of precious water and a bite of dry bread, Sarah would sometimes see him. The lone Apache rider, a distant, fluid silhouette against the shimmering heat haze on the horizon. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a deep familiarity with the harsh landscape, so unlike the clumsy efforts of settlers like herself. He was a part of this land, whereas she was merely clinging to its surface. Local gossip and the fearful tales swapped by other homesteaders painted the Apache as hostile, to be feared and avoided. Yet watching him, Sarah felt less fear than a strange, unnameable curiosity. He was another soul enduring this unforgiving place, a silent testament to survival. The cultural chasm between them felt as vast and sun-baked as the plains separating her homestead from the distant, hazy mesas of the San Carlos Reservation. Still, his presence was a reminder she wasn't entirely alone in the vastness, even if their worlds were entirely separate. One suffocating evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky, Sarah rummaged through John's meager belongings, stored in a battered wooden chest at the foot of their bed. His scent, faint traces of earth, sweat, and pipe tobacco, still clung to his worn denim shirt, bringing a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. Beneath a layer of mended clothes, she found his journal, a slim, leather-bound ledger. His handwriting, usually strong and clear, deteriorated in the final entries, becoming a spidery, erratic scrawl. Page after page chronicled his increasingly desperate, failed attempts to find more water. Deepening the well, searching for seeps, even ill-fated attempts at divining. Each line was a testament to his fading strength and eroding hope. The last entry, dated just a week before his death, simply read, "Sky like brass, earth like iron. God help us." The next page and all those after were starkly, heartbreakingly blank. It felt like a mirror to her own depleting reserves, her own uncertain future scribbled on an empty page. The water in the barrel outside was now down to the last few inches. The true test was upon her. The morning arrived with an almost audible click, like a latch falling into place, sealing her fate. The old well, her primary hope, finally surrendered. With a sickening, hollow groan, the pump handle moved freely, bringing up not even mud, just a dry, rasping sound from the depths. Panic, sharp and icy, pierced through Sarah's carefully cultivated composure. The rain barrel outside the kitchen, already dangerously low, now held their absolute last store of water, and a disturbing greenish film had begun to coat its surface. Thirst, once a nagging discomfort, transformed into a relentless, clawing beast. Her throat felt perpetually coated in dust. John had spoken, in more hopeful times, of a small, unreliable seep some miles to the west, near a distinctive outcrop of red rock he'd named Sleeping Giant. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had left. Fortifying herself with a mouthful of the brackish barrel water and a piece of hardtack, she set out at first light, the sun already a malevolent presence on the eastern horizon. Her earlier attempts to deepen the existing well by hand, armed with only a shovel and a pickaxe, had been a grueling, near-hopeless battle against stone and sun-baked clay. Days of backbreaking labor had yielded nothing but exhaustion, blistered palms, and a spirit frayed to the breaking point. As she walked, the heat intensified, pressing down like a physical weight. The landscape shimmered and distorted, the familiar landmarks wavering as if seen through water. A cruel irony. She tried to recall her grandmother's hushed tales from the old country, stories whispered by the fireside during her childhood in a land far greener than this. Vague fragments about listening to the earth, about finding hidden veins of water where none seemed to exist, surfaced in her memory. But the crucial specifics, the practical knowledge, were lost, like water seeping into the insatiable sand. Before leaving, in a fit of desperate innovation, Sarah had spread a clean canvas sheet on a patch of relatively cool ground behind the cabin, hoping to collect the meager morning dew. The yield upon her return would be pitiful, she knew, barely enough to moisten her cracked lips, yet she clung to even this sliver of a chance. The metallic tang of the last drops of water from her canteen, the dry rasp of her own breathing, the incessant buzz of unseen insects, these were the sounds of her solitary, desperate quest. Each step towards the supposed seep was an act of blind faith, a prayer whispered into the uncaring, heated air. The sun climbed, a disk of white fire in a bleached sky. Her vision began to blur at the edges, the red rocks of the sleeping giant wavering, then fragmenting. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Her knees buckled. The earth rushed up to meet her, harsh and unyielding. When awareness stuttered back, it was to a blessed patch of shade. A shadow fell over her, and for a terrified moment, she thought it was Blackwood come to gloat over her demise. But the figure that knelt beside her was leaner, his movements more fluid. It was Nakai, the Apache rider. His expression, usually an unreadable mask, held a flicker of something she couldn't decipher. Concern? Pity? He offered her a water skin, its surface cool and damp. The water within was unlike any she'd tasted, cool with a faint, clean taste of earth and a subtle minty undertone from the leaves he'd likely used to line the skin, an Apache method for keeping water fresh. He had used broad, fleshy leaves from a desert plant she didn't recognize to create a makeshift shade over her head, protecting her from the direct, brutal sun. Communication was a clumsy ballet of gestures and the few Spanish words that formed a fragile bridge between their languages. Agua? She managed, her voice a dry croak. Sí, he nodded, his dark eyes intense. Sol. Muy peligroso. He gestured towards the relentless sun, then to her prone form. He had evidently been observing her struggles from a distance, his presence in this vast wilderness more pervasive than she had realized. Perhaps the drought, an indiscriminate leveler of men and their ambitions, had eroded some small part of the wall between their peoples. Or perhaps it was simple human compassion, a quality she had almost forgotten existed. Revived, however precariously, by the water and the unexpected mercy, Sarah eventually struggled to her feet. The world still tilted, but the worst of the faintness had passed. Nakai watched her, saying little, but his presence was a silent anchor. He accompanied her for the first mile of her return journey, not speaking, merely walking a respectful distance away, a guardian silhouetted against the harsh landscape. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he melted back into the heat haze and the chaparral, leaving Sarah to contemplate the encounter. His intervention had been a lifeline, a reprieve from the sun's deadly embrace, but her relief was fleeting. As she neared her homestead, the sight of two of Blackwood's ranch hands near her dilapidated fence line sent a fresh jolt of cold dread through her. They weren't doing anything, merely sitting their horses, watching her cabin, their presence an unspoken but potent message of surveillance and intent. Blackwood himself rode up as she reached her gate, his horse kicking up plumes of dust that settled on her already grimy clothes. "Still clinging on like a stubborn weed, Mrs. Thompson?" he drawled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Heard tell your well finally gave up the ghost. This land has a way of weeding out the unfit. My offer still stands, though I confess its generosity diminishes with each passing day of this drought." His threats were more overt now, his patience clearly wearing thin. He gestured dismissively at her parched fields. "This place is finished. You're finished." That evening, the small cabin felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The encounter with Blackwood had left a bitter taste of fear in her mouth. Yet Nakai's unexpected aid had planted a tiny, confusing seed of something else. Not hope exactly, but a reluctant awareness that she wasn't entirely alone in her fight. Driven by a restless energy, a desperate need for some forgotten key to survival, Sarah pulled out the small, battered trunk that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that. It was filled with the remnants of a life left behind: yellowed linen smelling faintly of lavender, a chipped porcelain doll, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. And there, tucked beneath a heavy wool shawl wrapped in oilskin, she found it. Her grandmother's journal. Bound in dark, cracked leather, its pages brittle and smelling of old paper and pressed flowers, it felt like a direct link to the past, a lifeline thrown across generations. With trembling fingers, Sarah opened it, her heart pounding with a mixture of trepidation and a desperate, burgeoning hope. The old journal became Sarah's world. By the flickering, smoky light of the lard lamp, she pored over its pages night after night, the small cabin silent, save for the rustle of brittle paper and the distant chirping of crickets. The script was spidery and elegant, a European hand from a bygone era, and the language held an archaic charm. Her grandmother, a woman Sarah had only known through faded photographs and her mother's stories, had been a keen observer of the natural world, her entries filled with meticulous notes on weather patterns, soil conditions, and the peculiar challenges of farming in an unforgiving, arid region of the Old World. It was a legacy of resilience Sarah had never known she possessed. There were detailed sketches of unfamiliar plants, their root systems intricately drawn, their properties noted in the margins. She described specific tilling techniques, shallow furrows that barely disturbed the soil's surface, designed to conserve every precious drop of moisture. There were notes on companion planting, certain hardy herbs and vegetables that seemed to shield each other from the relentless sun and deter pests. And then, most tantalizingly, pressed carefully between two pages describing a particularly resilient strain of millet, Sarah found a small, brittle envelope. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, were a dozen or so dark, smooth seeds, unlike anything she had ever seen. A faded inscription on the envelope in her grandmother's hand read, Semina Speranza, seeds of hope, for times of great thirst and trial. These were not just seeds, they were a whispered promise from the past. These were techniques and heirlooms her own parents, blessed with more fertile land and gentler seasons back east, had never needed to employ. Now, in this crucible of drought, they felt like her only salvation. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of genuine, albeit fragile hope ignited within her. She began to see the parched earth not as a vindictive enemy, but as a profound challenge, one her ancestors had faced and somehow overcome. Remembering Nakai's uncanny knowledge of the local flora, the way he seemed to read the subtle hieroglyphics of the desert, Sarah knew that her grandmother's European wisdom needed to be tempered with an understanding of this specific, brutal landscape. Swallowing her ingrained settler's apprehension, the warnings of her former neighbors echoing faintly in her mind, she resolved to seek him out. It took 2 days of searching, of following barely discernible tracks across the sun-baked flats and into the rocky foothills that bordered the reservation lands. Finally, she found him near a small, shaded overhang of rock, where a few hardy, gray-green shrubs clung tenaciously to life. He was mending a piece of tack, his movements economical and precise. She approached cautiously, her heart thumping against her ribs. He looked up, his dark eyes watchful but not hostile. Sarah held out her grandmother's journal, open to a page with a particularly detailed sketch of a terraced planting system. "Agua," she said, her voice raspy, then gestured to the drawing, then to her own parched land. "Here? How? My grandmother knew this." She pointed to the seeds in their small envelope. "For no water." Nakai set aside his mending and took the journal, handling it with a surprising gentleness that belied his rugged appearance. He could not read the words, of course, but the drawings, the meticulous diagrams, spoke a universal language of cultivation and care. He studied them for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he nodded slowly. He recognized some of the principles, she could tell. Using a pointed stick, he began to draw in the dust at their feet, sketching shapes that echoed her grandmother's terraces but adapted to the local terrain. He pointed to certain desert plants around them, explaining with gestures and a mixture of Apache words and broken Spanish that they were indicators of subtle shifts in the soil, of where moisture might linger longest after a rare rain. Sky, earth, plant, they speak, he said, his English halting but imbued with a quiet authority. Water speaks low. You must learn its voice. Feel its breath. He showed her how the Apache used arrangements of stones not just for support, but to create microclimates, to channel dew, to shade tender roots. It was a revelation. A new, tentative understanding began to dawn between them, a silent acknowledgement of shared purpose. Sarah showed him a diagram from the journal for constructing a small, crescent-shaped swale designed to capture and hold any scant runoff. Nakai, in turn, demonstrated how his people used natural depressions and the strategic placement of rocks to achieve a similar end, creating small pockets of life in the arid expanse. It was a marriage of ancient wisdoms, European and Apache, both born of necessity and a deep respect for the land. Together, though their shared vocabulary remained small and gestures often substituted for words, they chose a small, relatively sheltered patch of earth near Sarah's cabin, one that caught the morning sun but was shaded from the worst of the afternoon blaze. Using her worn shovel and a hoe John had crafted, Sarah painstakingly dug the swale, shaping the dry, compacted earth according to her grandmother's instructions, her back aching, her hands blistered anew. Nakai, with an artist's eye, arranged stones around it, creating a pattern that was both functional and strangely beautiful. That night, an unexpected brief shower passed over the region, barely enough to wet the dust, but to Sarah, it felt like a blessing. By morning, a tiny, precious amount of moisture had collected in the bottom of the swale. With trembling hands, raw with effort and anticipation, Sarah planted a few of the precious heirloom seeds, tucking them gently into the damp earth as if they were sleeping children. A fragile, defiant hope, green and tender, in the face of the overwhelming, baked brown despair. The sun, however, climbed its customary arc, a constant glaring threat to her tiny, nascent garden. The seedlings, if they sprouted, would need more water within days, or they too would wither and die like all else on this thirsty land. The small patch of emerging green, a scattering of tiny, determined leaves unfurling from the heirloom seeds, was a balm to Sarah's weary soul. Each morning she would rush to the swale, her heart lurching with a mixture of hope and dread. The seedlings were frail, vulnerable, yet they represented a victory, however small. But the wider landscape remained a testament to the drought's brutal reign. The creek that marked the western edge of her property, a lifeline that Nakai had explained fed the shallow underground water table in the area, had dwindled to a muddy, stagnant trickle. Even the hardiest desert plants seemed to be curling in on themselves, surrendering to the relentless desiccation. One sweltering afternoon, as Sarah was carefully using a dipper to transfer a little of her precious barrel water to the base of each seedling, Nakai appeared. His silhouette against the glaring sun was, by now, a familiar and strangely comforting sight. His expression, however, was graver than usual. He had been tracking the creek bed further upstream, he explained through a combination of gestures and his slowly expanding English vocabulary towards the sprawling expanse of Silas Blackwood's Box B ranch. Water, much less now, he stated, his dark eyes troubled, fixed on the horizon where Blackwood's land began. Not just sun, man. He made a gesture of damming, of diverting. He suspected Blackwood wasn't merely waiting for the drought to deliver Sarah's small homestead into his greedy hands. He was actively manipulating the scarce water resources to hasten her demise and that of other smallholders, and critically, the Apache who relied on the same watershed. The ever-present environmental threat of the drought was now amplified, given a cunning human face. A cold knot of anger and apprehension tightened in Sarah's stomach. Driven by Nakai's grim suspicion, they set out the next morning at dawn, before the sun reached its zenith. They followed the pathetic remnants of the creek bed, moving with as much stealth as they could muster through the thorny scrub and treacherous rockfalls. The signs were subtle at first. Freshly disturbed earth along the banks where no animal would have caused to dig so extensively, an unseasonable and unnatural dryness in areas that, even in drought, should have retained some residual moisture. Nakai's keen eyes missed nothing, pointing out a snapped branch here, an out-of-place stone there, all suggesting recent human activity. Then, tucked away in a narrow, shadowy ravine, cleverly concealed by an artful arrangement of brush and boulders, they found it. A crudely but effectively constructed dam, a solid barrier of rocks, logs, and packed earth, stretched across the width of the creek bed. It was undeniably new. A significant portion of what little water still flowed was being diverted into a freshly dug channel, a muddy scar across the land leading directly towards Blackwood's vast cattle pastures. The audacity of the theft, the blatant disregard for anyone downstream, struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. The faint, gurgling sounds of the diverted water, a lifeblood stolen and rerouted for one man's profit, while their own lands withered and died, were a bitter, infuriating mockery. This wasn't just survival of the fittest. This was calculated greed, a deliberate strangulation. Back at her cabin, the sight of her own struggling seedlings felt almost like a betrayal. How could she nurture this tiny patch of life when the very source was being choked off? She tended them with a renewed, fierce determination, her grandmother's journal open beside her. She meticulously cleared any competing weeds, loosened the soil around their delicate roots, and created tiny, individual shades from scraps of canvas stretched over bent twigs. Nakai watched her patient, almost reverent efforts. Later, as they shared a meager meal of dried beans and a little parched corn, he spoke, his voice low and resonant. He told her a story, an old Apache tale, of how his ancestors had survived a great 7-year drought generations ago. They hadn't fought the land, he explained. They had listened to it, followed the ancient paths of water, moved with the seasons, and, most importantly, shared what little they had, ensuring the survival of the people, not just individuals. His words, spoken without embellishment, resonated deeply with Sarah's own burgeoning understanding of resilience and interconnectedness. The exchange went beyond mere survival tips. It was a sharing of spirit, of cultural memory, a philosophy forged in the crucible of this very land. He spoke of water not just as a physical necessity, but as a sacred gift, a spiritual lifeblood that connected all beings, all life. The trust between them deepened, an unspoken bond forged in shared hardship, a dawning respect, and now a common enemy. They knew they needed more than just their word against a man as powerful and ruthless as Silas Blackwood. They needed irrefutable proof of his water theft, evidence that would stand up even in the biased eyes of the distant territorial authorities. Carefully, stealthily, they returned to the hidden dam the following day. Sarah, her heart pounding, took out her own small journal, John's old ledger, now hers, and began to sketch the dam's construction, its location relative to recognizable landmarks. The path of the illegal diversion channel. Nakai, with his intimate knowledge of the terrain, pointed out specific details. The type of rock used, clearly sourced from a nearby Apache sacred site, adding sacrilege to theft. The age of the cut logs, suggesting the dam had been built very recently, just as the drought began to bite hardest. Sarah thought of composing a letter to the territorial marshal in Prescott, a remote figure of law and order, but a chilling doubt assailed her. Would such a man, likely beholden to powerful ranching interests, even bother to investigate the claims of a lone widow and an Apache man? Blackwood, meanwhile, seemed more brazenly confident than ever. New, larger herds of his cattle were seen grazing closer to the shared watercourse, a clear indication that he had no concerns about his water supply. This ostentatious display of resource control only intensified the pressure on Sarah and, she now understood, on Nakai's people as well. The survival countdown was not just for her tiny garden, nor for her own tenuous hold on the homestead. It was for the integrity of the entire watershed, for the very possibility of a just existence in this harsh land. Their clandestine investigations, however careful, did not go entirely unobserved. One of Blackwood's surly, hard-faced ranch hands, a man named Jedediah Stone, whose reputation for casual brutality was well known, spotted them near the ravine as they were making their final observations. He didn't approach immediately, but his eyes, narrowed with suspicion, followed them until they were out of sight. The next day, Stone rode deliberately close to Sarah's property line, his horse trampling a section of her already dilapidated fence. He paused, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and delivered his message, his voice flat and menacing. "Best you and your redskin friend mind your own affairs, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood don't take kindly to snoopin' and meddlin'. Some folks learn that the hard way." The threat, unspoken but deeply felt, hung heavy and poisonous in the hot, still air. That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in bruised colors of purple and orange, Nakai came to Sarah's cabin. He carried 2 items. The first was a gift, a beautifully crafted Apache water pot. Its reddish clay cool to the touch, its surface etched with intricate geometric designs that seemed to pulse with an inner life. "Keeps water cool," he explained, his English more confident now, pointing to the porous nature of the clay. Old way, good way. It was a practical offering, desperately needed, yet it felt like much more, a symbol of his growing respect, a tangible piece of his culture and trust shared with her. Then he unrolled the second item, a softened, supple piece of deer hide. On its smoked surface, drawn in faded pigments of ochre, charcoal, and berry juice, was a map. It was not a map of boundaries or property lines, but an ancestral record of the Apache lands as his people had known them for generations. It showed the sacred mountains, the hidden canyons, the migratory paths of game, and, most importantly, the ancient springs and water paths, the secret veins of life pulsing beneath the arid skin of the desert. His grandfather, a renowned shaman and storyteller, had drawn it, Nakai explained, passing down the knowledge. Many of the springs marked were now dry, lost to memory or diminished by the changing times and the coming of the settlers. But one faint, almost overlooked symbol, a small spiral indicating a life-giving spring, a place where the earth breathed moistly, seemed to be located remarkably close, perhaps even on Sarah's own parched, desperate land, a forgotten Apache secret waiting to be rediscovered. The revelation left by Nakai's ancestral map, with its faded spiral marking a potential spring directly on her land, settled over Sarah with the weight of profound possibility. Spread across the rough-hewn table in her cabin, her grandmother's journal lay open beside the softened hide. The European script and the Apache pictographs, 2 vastly different records of human experience, seemed to speak to each other in the flickering lamplight. Sarah traced the symbol on Nakai's map with a trembling finger, then ran her hand over a passage in her grandmother's diary where she described a peculiar dampness in the soil, in a certain hollow, a place where the earth breathes moistly, even in the driest season. A spot her grandmother had suspected held water but could never precisely locate or unearth. Her grandmother had also written about the ancient art of dowsing, a skill passed down through her family, a way of listening with a willow branch to the hidden whispers of subterranean water. "Your grandfather knew this place," Sarah said softly, looking at Nakai, her eyes shining with a new, almost fearful excitement. "And my grandmother? She felt it. She wrote of trying to find water with a forked stick." Nakai nodded slowly, his gaze intense. "My grandfather said some springs sleep deep. Sometimes they need to be woken." He understood the convergence, his people's ancient knowledge of the land's secret places, and her ancestors' almost forgotten European folk wisdom. Perhaps together they held the key. The possibility was a fragile spark, but in the oppressive darkness of the drought, it felt like a beacon. Reclaiming this forgotten spring, if it truly existed, would be more than just finding water for her farm. It would be an act of reclaiming her own heritage and forging an undeniable bond with Nakai's. It would also be a direct challenge to Blackwood's narrative of scarcity. The next morning, under a sky the color of bleached bone, Sarah fashioned a dowsing rod from a forked willow branch, just as her grandmother's journal described. Her hands felt clumsy, uncertain, but a strange sense of ancestral guidance seemed to flow through her. Nakai watched, silent and observant, his presence a steadying force. He led her to the hollow indicated on his map, a shallow depression dotted with withered scrub, a place Sarah had often passed without a second glance. It matched the vague descriptions in her grandmother's journal. With the forked willow held lightly in her hands, palms upward, Sarah began to walk slowly, her senses straining, trying to empty her mind and listen as her grandmother had written. The sun beat down, the air was still and scorching. Dust rose with each step. For what felt like hours, nothing happened. The branch remained inert, lifeless. Despair, a cold and familiar companion, began to creep in. She faltered, ready to give up. The weight of expectation, her own and perhaps Nakai's, too heavy. Patience, Nakai said softly from the edge of the hollow. The earth speaks low. Listen with your feet, not just the stick. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and tried again. She focused on the feel of the ground beneath her worn boots, the subtle shifts in temperature, the almost imperceptible changes in the air. And then it happened. A faint tremor, a subtle downward pull on the tip of the willow rod. Her heart leaped. She took another step and the pull intensified, the wooden fork straining in her grip as if drawn by an invisible current. It tugged, insistent, undeniable, towards a spot near a cluster of flat, sun-baked rocks. Here, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It's here. Together they began to dig. The ground was hard, baked almost to stone by the relentless sun, but beneath the surface layer the soil was surprisingly cool, then damp. They worked with a shared, almost frantic energy. Sarah with her shovel, Nakai with a sharpened digging stick he wielded with practiced efficiency. Hours passed under the brutal sun. Sweat stung Sarah's eyes, her muscles screamed in protest, but the hope of water cool and clean drove her onward. Finally, Nakai's stick struck something that wasn't rock, it was wet, yielding mud. With a final, desperate heave, they cleared away a large, flat stone, and there, welling up slowly from the earth, was a seep of clear, fresh water. It wasn't a gushing torrent, not yet, but it was undeniably water, cool and sweet, bubbling gently from the depths. Sarah sank to her knees, tears streaming down her dusty face, and plunged her hands into the miraculous wetness. Nakai watched her, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. They had done it. They had woken a sleeping spring. This small, precious gift from the earth had the power to save her farm, to restore her hope. The discovery of the spring changed everything. It was a private miracle, but its implications were far-reaching. With a reliable, albeit modest, water source now on her own land, Sarah was no longer entirely at the mercy of the drought or Blackwood's manipulations. The spring, carefully managed, could sustain her small garden, perhaps even a few fruit trees, a small flock of chickens. It was independence earned through a combination of ancestral wisdom and shared effort. Nakai, seeing the transformative power of this reclaimed water, proposed a bold plan. This water, he said, gesturing to the slowly filling basin they had dug around the spring, it is your strength. Blackwood, he says the land is dead, that only he can make it live with this big water. Your spring tells a different story. He suggested they use the existence of Sarah's spring, coupled with the undeniable evidence of Blackwood's illegal dam, to rally the other small homesteaders who were also suffering. Together, Nakai urged, many voices are louder than one. We show them Blackwood lies. We show them there is hope, if we fight for the water that belongs to all. The spring was not just about Sarah's survival anymore. It was a symbol, a weapon, a means to expose corruption and fight for a shared future. The decision to confront Blackwood's stranglehold on the region's water was not taken lightly. Sarah, with Nakai's quiet, steadfast support, began to visit the other struggling homesteaders scattered across the arid valley. Many were families pushed to the brink, their faces etched with the same fear and despair Sarah had known so intimately. Some listened with a flicker of desperate hope in their eyes as she recounted her discovery of the spring and showed them Nakai's careful drawings of Blackwood's illegal dam. The combination proof of deception and a tangible example of an alternative water source was potent. A few, their spirits already broken, or their fear of Blackwood too deeply ingrained, shook their heads muttering about the folly of angering such a powerful man. He owns the judge, owns the marshal too, most like, one old man whispered, his gaze darting nervously towards the distant outline of Blackwood's vast ranch. But others, particularly those with young children and nothing left to lose, felt a surge of righteous anger. A small, determined group agreed to sign a collective petition detailing Blackwood's actions and demanding an official investigation by the territorial authorities. News of this nascent rebellion, as Blackwood undoubtedly saw it, traveled fast in the sparsely populated territory. His response was swift and predictable. His ranch hands, led by the menacing Jedediah Stone, became a more visible, intimidating presence. They rode patrols along property lines, their expressions stony, their hands never far from the guns on their hips. One homesteader who had vocally supported Sarah found his meager hay store mysteriously burned. Another reported his last few chickens vanishing overnight. The threats were unspoken but clear: silence or face the consequences. One blistering afternoon, as Sarah and Nakai worked to carefully channel the small overflow from their spring towards her heirloom seedlings, which were now showing remarkable resilience, Blackwood himself appeared. He rode directly onto her land, his horse trampling the fragile edge of her cultivated patch, a deliberate act of desecration. He was flanked by Stone and another grim-faced rider. "So the widow Thompson fancies herself a water witch now, does she?" Blackwood sneered, his eyes cold and hard as agate, fixed on the small, clear pool of the spring. "And consorting with savages to stir up trouble, I hear." Sarah straightened, her hands clenched at her sides. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a steely determination she hadn't possessed months ago. "This is my land, Mr. Blackwood, and this is my water, given by the earth, not stolen from others." Her voice was clear, carrying a surprising strength. "We know about your dam, and soon everyone will—" Nakai stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Sarah, a silent, formidable shield. He said nothing, but his gaze, locked on Blackwood, was unwavering, filled with an ancient, unyielding strength that seemed to make the larger man flinch almost imperceptibly. Blackwood's face purpled with rage. "You'll regret this, both of you," he snarled. "This land, this water, it answers to men like me, not to dirt-scratching squatters and thieving Indians." He wheeled his horse around abruptly and galloped off, his men following, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent fury hanging in the air. The petition, bearing a dozen signatures and accompanied by Sarah's meticulous sketches and Nakai's carefully worded testimony, transcribed by Sarah, eventually made its way to Prescott. For weeks there was no response. Hope dwindled. Then, unexpectedly, a dusty buckboard arrived, carrying a weary, skeptical-looking territorial marshal named Hatcher. He was a man clearly more accustomed to dealing with horse thieves and saloon brawls than intricate disputes over water rights, and his initial attitude was one of profound indifference, bordering on annoyance. He listened to Sarah's account, examined her spring, and then, with obvious reluctance, agreed to ride out to inspect the alleged illegal dam, largely, Sarah suspected, because Nakai's quiet dignity and the unspoken threat of displeasing the Apache nation as a whole carried more weight than her own frantic words. The inspection of Blackwood's dam was tense. Blackwood was there, of course, blustering and dismissive, claiming the dam was on his property and essential for his legitimate business operations. The marshal seemed inclined to agree, the path of least resistance clearly appealing to him. He proposed a compromise. Blackwood could maintain his dam, perhaps with some minor, unenforceable modifications to allow a trickle downstream, if Sarah, in turn, was guaranteed sole access to her newfound spring, with no further interference. It was a tempting offer for Sarah personally. It would secure her farm, her future. Blackwood surprisingly grunted his grudging assent, likely seeing it as a way to legitimize his larger water theft and silence the broader complaints, effectively isolating Sarah. All eyes turned to Sarah. The marshal waited, impatient. Nakai stood a little apart, his face unreadable, but Sarah felt the weight of his unasked question. This was her threshold. Her grandmother's journal spoke of sharing, of community, not just individual survival. Nakai's people lived by a creed of communal responsibility for resources. To accept this offer would be to betray everything she had come to believe, everything she and Nakai had built together. She took a deep breath. "No, Marshal, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. That is not a just solution. That water, the water in that creek, she pointed upstream, it belongs to everyone along its banks, settlers and Apache alike, according to their need and the ancient ways this land has always known. My spring is a gift, yes, but it does not give Mr. Blackwood the right to steal from others. The dam must come down. The water must flow freely for all. She looked directly at Nakai, a silent promise passing between them. She had made her choice, an irreversible commitment to a justice that extended beyond her own fence line, a decision that honored the cultural boundaries and shared resources Nakai had taught her to respect. The marshal stared, momentarily stunned into silence by her audacity. Blackwood's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. Marshal Hatcher, a man more used to the blunt calculus of frontier justice than nuanced arguments about water ethics, was visibly taken aback by Sarah's unwavering stance. Perhaps it was her unexpected eloquence or the quiet, unshakable dignity of Nakai standing beside her, or even a long dormant flicker of his own conscience. But something shifted in his demeanor. He looked from Sarah's earnest face to Blackwood's purpling rage, then to the faces of the few other homesteaders who had dared to accompany them, their expressions a mixture of fear and desperate hope. He re-examined Sarah's sketches of the dam, then scrutinized the structure itself with a more critical eye. The evidence of recent extensive work, combined with the clear diversion of the bulk of the stream, was undeniable. The land downstream, including access points traditionally used by Nakai's people, was visibly suffering. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire territory, the marshal finally rendered his verdict. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice now firm, "this dam is an illegal impediment to a public watercourse. It is to be dismantled. Immediately." Blackwood erupted in a torrent of threats and protests, but Hatcher, having finally made his decision, stood firm, his hand resting pointedly on the Colt at his hip. Defeated and fuming, Blackwood was forced to order his own reluctant men to begin the arduous task of tearing down their handiwork. The sight of the first rocks being dislodged, the first trickles of liberated water finding their old path was a profound victory. Water, the lifeblood of the arid land, began to flow more freely, a silver ribbon snaking its way towards the thirsty homesteads and the traditional Apache watering grounds. Blackwood's power, though not entirely broken, was significantly diminished, his reputation for untouchability fractured. He remained a bitter, resentful neighbor, but the fear he had once inspired had begun to recede. Sarah's small spring, now managed with a careful blend of her grandmother's European dry farming techniques and the water conservation wisdom Nakai had shared, flourished. She built small check dams and diversion channels, using every drop of water wisely. Her garden became a small, vibrant oasis, producing enough vegetables not only for herself and Nakai, but also a little to share with others. Her farm, once a symbol of despair, transformed into a testament to resilience and innovative stewardship. Years passed, marked by the slow turning of the seasons. The raw edges of grief for John had softened, replaced by a quiet acceptance and the warmth of a new, profound love. Sarah and Nakai married, their union a quiet testament to the bridges that could be built between cultures, between hearts. Their homestead became a place of gentle abundance, a model for sustainable agriculture in the challenging Arizona climate. Their children, a boy with Sarah's auburn hair and Nakai's dark, thoughtful eyes, and a girl with her father's raven hair and her mother's determined chin, grew up speaking two languages, their hands skilled in both Apache crafts and settler farming techniques. They were children of two worlds, inheritors of a blended legacy. In their cabin, which had been carefully expanded over the years, Sarah's grandmother's journal lay on a shelf beside Nakai's ancestral hide map, tangible symbols of their intertwined heritage. Apache baskets sat comfortably alongside stoneware crocks, and the tools they used in their daily lives were a mix of traditional indigenous implements and sturdy settler ironwork. The stories told by their fireside were drawn from both traditions, tales of coyote tricksters and European folk heroes, of Apache resilience and homesteader grit. These preserved cultural artifacts were not museum pieces, but living parts of their family's identity. The impact of their stand against Blackwood and their subsequent success with blended land management rippled outwards. The restored water flow benefited the entire small community, both settler and Apache. While prejudices did not vanish overnight, a greater, albeit still imperfect, understanding and cooperation began to emerge regarding the sharing of scarce resources. The success of Sarah and Nakai's farm demonstrated that working with the land, respecting its limits and its indigenous knowledge, was more fruitful than brute exploitation. Their shared stewardship became a quiet lesson for all who cared to observe. One cool desert evening, as the sky blazed with the colors of a painter's final glorious flourish, Sarah and Nakai, older now, their faces etched with the lines of lives fully lived, walked hand in hand to the edge of their land. They looked out at the thriving fields, the contented sounds of their small herd of goats, the smoke curling from their chimney. A stark, beautiful contrast to the parched, hopeless earth Sarah had faced alone so many years ago. The drought cycles still came, as they always would in this arid land. But now they were prepared, their blended knowledge a powerful shield, their community more resilient. They had forged more than just a farm. They had cultivated a legacy of respect, love, and an enduring partnership with the earth and with each other. The whispers on the wind no longer spoke of despair, but of connection, of resilience, of the enduring power of water and the human spirit to find common ground, even in the harshest of landscapes.